to follow up on that with a similar question is one other thing we've been talking about on like WhatsApp messages and stuff like that is WhatsApp, right? Is maybe the threshold of the muscles to like what is going to grow it optimally as far as the movement patterns and the specific technique is concerned is just lower than we think, because we've been saying a lot that like if we look at most bodybuilders, like the most stereotypical bodybuilding back workout is rows for thickness, wide grip pull downs for width, and Ronnie Coleman, I think, pretty sure he did that mainly, and then deadlifts, depending on whether you want to call that a back exercise. And I mean, he had all the iliac lat development you'd ever want, and so I'm wondering, like, is it the case that like even those will hit those regions? Which I mean, so if I'm looking at a pull around or chest supported pull down that you're doing, yeah, I mean that it makes sense that that's the ideal movement pattern, and a wide grip pull down and even a row. I mean, it's barely has anything in common with those. But maybe those work as well. It's just like it's just a less efficient way to like that's what Doug Brignoli is talking about all the time, right? Like you can use a smooth ride or a very bumpy ride. but is that the case that like, yeah, it's gonna happen still, it's just maybe it will take longer, will be less efficient? So what do you think?
Well, the first thing I like to say with that argument is this does not assume that we know more than we do, right? Because I mean, most people assume the way Ronnie trained is based off of the pictures that he took for magazines, which often is not actually a reflection of the exercises that somebody does the most. It's the ones that happen to be there. So maybe you bought one of his programs or you watch his videos, but I mean, Ronnie did pull downs and he did pull ups. And if you're holding 800 pounds on a barbell, I don't think you can say that there isn't anything at the shoulder girdle that isn't working at that point in time, right? I mean, just so I would say, when you're looking at that, that's why I said, I think, yeah, you could say that, like, could he have gotten there, better, easier, faster? Possibly, right? But also there's so many variables. I mean, it could have been that, like, for him, he's just such a good responder to training, that things that will make a difference for somebody that, has a hard time training don't matter to Ronnie, because they're just such small variables compared to the other things that, that he's doing, right? Because I mean, this is what I like to do is you have people look at some of these guys when they're really, really young, like looking at a 20-year-old like Flex, or an 18-year-old Jay Cutler,
15-year-old Arnold.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, so some of these guys, right, in their late teens have better physiques than other guys will have training their entire life, right? And are we going to say that, like, well, for those guys, it's because of the exercises that they were repping out, like with the, whatever, with the concrete sand weights or whatever that they had at home when they were in their teens, right? I mean, no, I mean, so optimizing exercise is definitely a variable, right? But it exists in terms of magnitude with all of the other things, right? And genetics and anabolics and all of that stuff are there. And if you just have, like, if your genetic variable is just turned up to level 12, right? Is bringing your exercise technique, up a little bit going to be noticeable for that person? No, because they're the person that's like, look, I open the door to go outside. I open the door in my car, or whatever, and I grow lats because I'm just that type of responder. That's a joke that our coach Adam says, is like, there are those guys where, that's what they do. They just grow things, right? Like Flex Wheeler, amazing guy. Look at his hands, his forearms. Like, the guy's got muscles that he does not train, right? Like, how many of those guys have just massive anterior tibs? You ever seen them do anterior tibs, right? They got like thumb muscles and things like they don't have a carpentry hobby, that they're doing at home. So I mean, they're growing stuff that's just getting
wouldn't the
such a
argument
little
apply? Because like this is a very frequent response that we see, right? And people's like, well, there's all of us, and then there's the genetic elites, and as if like ignoring almost the reality that there's a bell curve, of course, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it's not a separate variable. Like there's like, of course, if we're saying what results in your final physique, yeah, genetics, steroids, consistency, exercise selection, nutrition, all of that. But to me, genetics is this overarching thing. And you could make an argument that somebody with better genetics should be able to pick up these differences more. Because if I have the potential to gain 30 pounds of muscle as an adult, but the freakiest of freak has the potential to gain 70 pounds of muscle, then if they switch this exercise technique, they turn that on, then they might notice like a 1% difference is going to be, 2 point, whatever the math was, 33% or times more. You know what I mean? So I think
what I would say is that say their limit is that they have a potential of 70 pounds. Because I think better training can get them to 70 pounds faster, but I don't think it can make their potential 80 pounds. Does that make sense?
I totally agree with that.
Right.
But I'm saying, if we're saying like, well, pull-ups and pull downs and all these things applied and worked for Ronnie, I don't think the argument of, well, he just has this great response to training would apply any differently with exercise selection than it could to us. You could make the same argument that we could do all those things and get there. It's just on a smaller scale. But I would argue that you'd still get there just like they would get there.
Yeah. Well, look at it. Let's look at it this way. So say you take an exercise that it's going to have something is always the limiter in exercise. So let's assume the row, which, by the way, if you look at Ronnie doing the narrow row, it is a pull around for Ronnie, by the way. By the time he's holding most of those handles, it is a pull around, just FYI, right? Score 1 for the pull around. But so you take one of those exercises and it's like, okay, this muscle, or this exercise, if we look at it, we can say like, well, this tissue is probably getting the majority of that stimulus, and then things adjacent to it are getting some, and and then there's things that are getting less and less and less. So if one of the things that happens with genetics is the threshold for how you respond to it, or what is a stimulus for you for hypertrophying, is set so low, that means that person, while they're targeting one exercise, is getting benefits in these other adjacent things that maybe they aren't training directly or putting as much volume or whatever into, right? And if we look at that and we say, well, if lower genetics just means that everything moves down, well, what that means is that if a person with poor genetics is doing it, is they might not have like any hope of hitting a significant threshold in more like tissue as it gets more and more adjacent, meaning that they're going to likely have to be a little bit more diverse in their training to grow some of that, to make everything in their body reach their potential, right? Because they're just not going to be hitting that threshold well enough across everything. So like, say if you just did the barbell lifts, if you have great genetics and all you do is SBD, like we've seen it in strongman and powerlifting and whatnot, that like occasionally you get one of these guys and it's like, well, all right, he's not doing a lateral raise for all the different divisions of their delts or whatever, but they look like a bodybuilder, and they have a very limited amount of motions that they train, right? But then you'll see a not so gifted person taking that same approach, and they'll have a very biased development to their physique. Well, they have a lot of strong points and very weak points. Have you guys noticed that at all? Like you can see both of those two extremes, and that's kind of what I'm getting at is that if it is a thing where you think of it as like, so if we look at like a bell curve, thinking that the thing that would be the top of the bell curve would be the muscle that would be getting the most out of a given exercise, and then adjacently things are going down. The genetic person, that whole bell's raised. So basically an exercise that's not great for something is enough for them. But for a regular person, an exercise that's not great for that may not be enough to move it. So they're just simply going to have to do a few more things if they want to bring their entire physique up to its potential.
I mean, it makes sense if I think about it, because we could make the argument that, okay, so Ronnie Coleman, he's the freakiest freak out there. Bryan, for example, he's not Ronnie Coleman, but he has pretty decent genetics. He still has all those like iliac lat fibers fully developed, at least like to me, you're just looking at it. I could be wrong. And, for most of his training career, from what he told me, he didn't train like this. Like he did CrossFit and like max OT and whatever with different lifts. And I did a bunch of other stuff as well. I don't have that really impressive like lower lat development. So yeah, it all moves on a spectrum. So and the same, like, I never did a push, what's the name, press around in my life. I have a pretty decent chest, and some other guys probably doing all of the press arounds and still has a worse chest than mine. So I mean, God gives, God takes away.
I actually have a question kind of related to the press around thing too. And it's a common one that I actually get in my DM too, whenever I'm posting videos of me doing press arounds. And it's some variation of like, why does it matter if we get the pec completely short? Like, on one spectrum, you have like the Ronnies and people like that just bench pressed and did dumbbell flies and like never really even hugged the rib cage type thing. But then even on another spectrum, you have something like, a close grip cable press or a dumbbell press where you do get a little bit of adduction coming across and it doesn't get it completely short. So what is it about like the last 2 inches or whatever that you're getting from the press around that make it so special and advantageous?
Well, so it depends on the goal and the context, but I know you've been really riding that lengthened bias train, like hard pendulum swing. And I'm not as far in that direction as you. Like, I do think for sure, like, this is, and we've been doing this for over a decade of like using more lengthened bias exercises for hypertrophy. But, I don't think that like that. I don't think we can look at through the lenses that like, well, short position exercises are now not good for hypertrophy, because you like the amount of fatigue that you accumulate from them is way less than the amount of soreness that you get and whatnot, right? So we don't have research to say like, hey, you could have the option of doing this exercise for 4 sets and being like blistering sore for the next 3 days or whatever and get this result, or you could do this other thing for 6 or 7 sets and you could potentially maybe get the same amount of hypertrophy and less discomfort, right? So just understand that like, we're not accounting for everything. And we've also, we've looked at like, well, what's it look like to actually take a short position exercise to true fatigue versus just fatigue in the fully short position? And none of the research that we have is taking that muscle, like, is taking it into partials or whatever, right? So just laying that on there. But when we look at what the most, like training at the most short of the position is, right? The main benefit from a fatigue standpoint and from doing it from a nutrient partitioning perspective is actually eliminating the lengthened position more so than it is having to shorten. But you got to train somewhere, right? So you can't be like, well, I'm not going to do the lengthen range, so I'm just going to like do little presses, like little quarter reps in the middle. You got to go somewhere to get the mechanical tension work. But from an orthopedic side, right, training at the 2 extreme range of motions tends to be extremely good for maintaining orthopedic health, range of motion, mobility. Because remember, when you are stretching one muscle, the thing that is stabilizing that is the other muscle in its extreme short position, right? So your press around exercise is the shoulder stability exercise for your pull around. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. And vice versa. So I think you're doing a disservice to somebody by not keeping like short positions even in their hypertrophy programs, but just at a lower volume. If you're looking at maintaining their mobility and their joint health and injury prevention over time, right? But I mean, if you get them in through periodization, that's fine. But I don't think that if you're just like, well, research says lengthen exercises are more efficient for hypertrophy if we do the variables on a 1-to-1 ratio, that you just only do lengthen exercises, right? Because that is the squat, bench, dead type crowd, right? Like, and like, so, but like, we don't do any corrective exercise. We don't do like any mobility, right? Like, like I will get people that like, as an old person now, can we say that, Brian? Are we old now?
40's old, man.
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
Yeah. Just by just simply including like these extreme ranges in training. I don't do any stretching. I don't do any mobility work, whatever. Never have to. I've had no injuries. And we get people in that like, that's their profession, is they do, like, that's what they are. They're the stretchy, foam release, smash with everything, activate everything. And I'll have more joint mobility than them relative, right? You know, like I'm not a contortionist or anything, but the amount of benefit that you get outside of hypertrophy using these positions, I think warrants keeping them in, because it's not that they don't add anything to like how much stimulus you're getting, right? It's just that maybe it's different. And what we don't know a lot of is whether or not there's synergy in the two things, right? Because it's like, well, are we getting anything different from that, you know, short position that we don't get in the lengthened position, right? Because what maybe are we getting more at the lengthened position, like maybe more calcium mediated stuff, maybe some more of the things, you know, with the sensors and the titin protein and whatnot. Like that's probably what's giving that more of that mechanical tension stimulus there. But on the other end, is there anything that we get there that we don't, right? Or is it simply just like, hey, you know, we can play with these things, you know, as you, I mean, you guys all coach in some capacity, right? You know, one of the things that, you know, we'll do is like, hey, when you get somebody new, start that, like if they're a person that like, you know, they're going to be beat up and like say maybe they're, you know, they got a job they got to go to that they can't afford to like be super sore and destroyed, you might be like, hey, I'm going to choose shortened based exercises because likely for you, you're still going to get stronger. There's going to be plenty good for hypertrophy. They're going to be plenty good for everything that we're doing for a body comp perspective right now. And I know I can get away with these exercises right now and get you acclimated to training without being like miserable and beat up, and maybe even tolerate a little bit more volume that might go towards your strengthening and body composition goals. And then we can start introducing more lengthened stuff later when it's not going to like completely cripple you because you're coming in with zero training, right? Like it's an important consideration for anybody that trains anybody in like law enforcement and stuff like that, right? Because you can't afford to have crippling DOMs if you know your physical prowess is, you know, part of what's going to keep you alive on the day to day, right?
I definitely have my own justifications for why I include short overload movements, and I don't just train length. And like, yes, I am hard on that bandwagon, but I do have short overload movements in my program too. But I really like what you said about it being the end range of one being the shortened of the other, because that's something I learned, you know, with you at the practical, and it hasn't recently popped into my brain until you said that. So I think more about like kind of the metabolic accumulation, the fatigue cost compared to lengthened exercises, the ability to accrue volume, kind of where you went with that as well. And potentially regional hypertrophy too. Like I know there was at least a leg extension study that showed different hypertrophy at the short position than it did at the lengthened position. So that's one of the justifications that I use as well. But I was just curious if you thought there was, you know, specifically with the push around versus, you know, a dual cable press, whether there was something like even extra about those last couple inches, because even in a cable press, you are still hitting that short you're not getting it completely short, but it's short overloaded. It's an ambiguous place to be.
My guess is there's a regional hypertrophy component, but I'm hesitant to make that claim because like everybody likes to come at me for anything that I say. But the tricep test that we just did on the different positions, we did multiple positions on the long head, and there was regional specific activity in the long head of the tricep, depending on whether you were in the short or the lengthened position, right? So the superior and inferior portions of that muscle were recruited differently, whether it was a short or a lengthened position. So I think that's going to be a component. But then again, you know, how much is that going to matter, right? You know, and the answer is always like, well, over how much time and with how much effort and how much volume, right? So unfortunately, all four of us probably care way more or way too much about this stuff. So we think it matters.
Awesome. The muscle fiber is like a rope, and you can't can't have that different hypertrophy.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask your opinion on something. Or like, should we like stop like in this moment and this was like a funny wrap up, or
I'm good on time still if you guys are.
I'm good
until 4:30.
Okay.
Well, 4:30 EST.
Awesome. So one thing I wanted to ask your opinion on is cheat reps, and do you think that they are completely stupid, or do you think they have a place? Because like this is what I just said to the guys before the call, that that's why I was late, because I was sending these voice notes. Just kidding. That like I noticed that people moving big weights with this atrocious form is maybe I'm completely wrong about this, but I tend to see that with actually pretty impressive physiques. And I mean, this could be completely random, even if that's true, but I could see two benefits. One is that sometimes that might be the way to like provide that slight like overload, quote unquote, that you can't by going heavier, because maybe the weight increment is just too big, like on a pull down, for example, or maybe the heavy eccentrics. If you like, you use some atrocious form to get the weight down, and then you like control the way up. So what do you think?
It's going to be exercise dependent, because sometimes, when you can responsibly add, more momentum and things like that, and it can actually make the profile a little bit better. And then in other scenarios, it might make the resistance profile actually worse, and you end up just doing all of the work with something else, right? And the other thing is to remember that the only people that sling big weights are big people. So you're always going to see that correlation, right? Like, oh, I always see big guys, throwing this around like that, because only big guys can throw around that kind of weight, right? But you do see people flinging around little weights, and you know what? They're little people. They're not, they're not that impressive. So
I'm not noticing those somehow.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they tend not to make it high on the Instagram.
They're all using strict form.
Yeah, and they're all at the 24-hour or big box gym fitness place. But what you should look at is, okay, are you able to basically make that muscle? Yes, are you? Yes, you are. Are you able to make that muscle do more of the work? And what I'd say is, like, from an injury perspective, doing dynamic eccentrics is probably the most like risky thing that you can do in the weight room, right? It's, almost very, very like a significantly smaller amount of injuries occur on the concentric period, right? And most injuries in the weight room and in sport happen in dynamic eccentric, right? So that means, like, say you were going to do like a cheater row or something like that. If you're getting a little bit of body momentum to, help you get it back, I would say, yeah, that's probably, one strategy that you could use to eke out a little bit more intensity, a few more reps at the end, et cetera. But letting that heavy weight then rip you back forward faster is likely where you would have the problem. So, for instance, I have never had an athlete tear a lat. I've never had an athlete of mine personally tear anything, to be honest, in the gym. But I have had multiple bodybuilders, super strong dudes, tear their lats, like doing water skiing, that quick eccentric, right? So yeah, so I've had no injuries in the gym, but I've had 3 athletes tear their lats, getting their fat butt pulled out of the water, right? And just having that sudden eccentric, right? Maybe it's because their lats were so big that there was too much water resistance, I don't know.
Or the wind just caught into it.
Right. Yeah. But so that you should consider, it's like, all right, if I'm doing this right, am I still making that target muscle a big contributor to whatever that extra movement is being, and how safe is that, right? And I'm not saying that to be like a fear monger. I'm just saying there's no point in taking extra risks if you could use something different, like, a slower tempo or a rest pause or range of motion drop set, or like any sort of other thing to add intensity and effort in, right? Because it's like, there's always options, right? There's always options, right? Brian knows this. There's like 62 different ways to start biasing the length and position more now, right? And it's like, the one might make sense for one exercise, but it might not make sense for another exercise.
Kind of on the topic of length, and I have a question that's kind of selfish, because I really I'm curious on your opinion. So I'm just going to be quick with it. But when you see people doing these short overload movements and approaching failure, there's kind of 2 different ways that people approach failure. You have those that really grind through the short position, and you see like the rep speeds slow down, and there's like a lot of effort, and you can get a lot of reps in those like really highly short overloaded movements by just continuing to grind and push. And then you see another camp of people kind of just pulling as hard as they can or pushing as hard as they can. And wherever that stopping point is, that like soft stop, they just kind of like stop and let go. And then they let the range of motion like gradually fall off. And there's never really any like grinding or trying to push through the short position. And then you see the same thing when people go into partials. So you see those people that'll just stop wherever the partial stops you and then kind of release and go again. And then you see the opposite where people will hit whatever the sticking point is in that partial and then try to grind through that. So do you have any perspective or thoughts on that? Because I've been thinking a lot about that recently.
So grinding directly correlates to compensation, right? So the more grindy a rep, right, the more you're getting other things, the adjacent tissues, to help with that, right? So like, I mean, take something like a hack squat, right, which is a relatively fixed pattern, right? But you grind through that top because you're getting close to stacking. And so what you'll actually do is you'll subtly fluctuate between knee motion and hip motion to try and like slowly inch into that stacked position, right? Which is why like people start to get like the shake and stuff like that in there, right? Now, if you need to do that as a skill, you need to exhibit that strength, then I'd say like, well, then you may have to train that. But I would say at that point in time, that's probably where you're getting the worst SFR, if you will, right? Because neurologically, that is now an extremely complex movement. So you're going to get way more peripheral fatigue that carries into the rest of the workout and your next set and over for very little added stimulus, because of more and more of the rep is now being done with other musculature, right? So the more you want it to be targeted, the less grindy reps you're going to do, okay? Also, orthopedically, right, grindy reps are more stressful on all of those tissues, right? So you could take that into consideration too, right? Of whether or not it might just be better off doing a good set with a good clear endpoint than trying to add, a few of those grindy reps. Because, I mean, this is where like, you're not coming to our progressive overload course, man, you should be here. We'll talk about like what failure is when the resistance profile is different and the range of motion is different and stuff like that, because it's a different degree of fatigue and a different type of fatigue there than say if you just like continued partials, but you just kept only going to the range before you started kind of like that really shaky grind compensatory contraction, right? So I tend, especially from a hypertrophy perspective, right, which is always trying to maximize the stimulus and minimize any degradation, would be like, hey, let's get as much of the targeted stimulus out of this as possible and use strategies like pauses and partials and stuff over grindy reps.
That's really interesting, because I've always looked at the grindy reps as like, this is me actually getting to failure. Like, you want to see the rep speed slow down as you approach failure. Like Jeff Nippard made that whole video on it relatively recently where he demonstrated that. And so but I do feel all of that, like all those things you're saying, like compensations and it being more neurologically fatiguing and all this stuff. I certainly feel all of that. So that's very helpful.
And it's not a switch, right? It's a gradient that's going to occur like over a couple reps most. And like if you're training really low reps, then yeah, you got like a clean rep and then whatever. But like if you're training, mostly for hypertrophy ranges or a little bit above, then you're likely going to have like a small window where you can kind of choose where the appropriate cutoff is in some of those exercises that afford that grinding opportunity, right? And if you want to make that decision process easier, just train at a lower rep range.
Right? Well, that's what I do.
Because then that window gets closer. Because you should still see your rep range drop off, but that's another thing that's very different, because the amount that the rep speed changes across different exercises is huge, and that's also affected by resistance profiles and stuff, et cetera, right? Like I remember, Lyle going off and on, and fighting with Mike, like, well, everybody's last rep should be like 7.5 seconds or whatever. I'm like, do you know what it would take for me to have to do a 7? There's like pretty much in the majority of the exercises and loads I train with, like there are no 7-second reps. Like a 7-second rep would be me holding a quarter rep for like 5.5 seconds. Like there would be it would be a 5.5 second isometric on top of a quarter of a rep. That's the only way like that any of these motions would get 7 seconds with the technique and the exercise selection that we use. Right now, the more general an exercise is, meaning that it's working across muscles and more joints that are going to be involved, well, you have more compensation, so you can add more slower reps on top of that, right? So if you guys want to test this for yourself, just look at how your rep speed changes in a single joint exercise versus a 2-joint exercise, right? And likely what you're going to have is that single joint exercise, like your last full rep that you're going to get is not going to be that much speed difference compared to if you're doing a compound exercise where you can kind of squeeze 2 joints, like that the shaky dumbbell press that everybody can kind of like finish with that lasts, like 10 seconds. You never have a 10-second curl that you finish all the way up unless you do some body English, like shoulder flexion, leaning back type of thing. What happens
Yeah, I
is
was
the
going
rep
to say,
gets
I might
kind of
have to
slow and then you
record
don't.
some stuff for you because, again, it does involve a compensation, but I would argue that with some of the compounds too. Like I think the workout I'm going to do in like an hour is I do a seated alternated dumbbell curl, and my left arm is weaker. So that last rep, I mean, it's not 10 seconds, but I'll record it today. I would be thinking it's probably about 7 seconds. And the same thing with the overhead. Again, I don't know how much I compensate on that. I'll be interested to see the form, but it's a slow rep for sure.
What rep range are you working in?
The dumbbell curl is a rest pause, but that last one is about 8 reps. So it would be like 15, so 8, whatever. So
lower rep ranges.
The higher rep range, the slower you can get the last rep. For sure.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So I think, Dave's screwing me up because he trains higher reps than what we use for hypertrophy.
I'm always 5 to 10. So I know what you mean. Like I reach that stopping point where I make a rep and then it's like, oh, there's not going to be another rep unless it's super grind. Like the one I always keep thinking of is the cable row. Cause I really do feel like with that one, I can just grind. Like I have a slow rep and then I can do 6 more, and that one specifically, I've been thinking like, if I just reach fully shortened for the rear delts and then kind of release and just go to wherever that stopping point is, instead of trying to like inch my way to full range of motion, that's probably a more effective approach.
Yeah. Look at it, because one of the things that you can get with that too is a lot of people do it and they'll end up like where the rep normally would have been 10% less range, is that they compensate that by just letting the ribs go forward.
Yeah. Right. I do that. My elbow drops a little. My elbow drops a little bit. Yeah.
So, so with all this stuff, right? It's you're making judgment calls on technique loss and stuff like that with that. But I mean, put it this way: if you're training to the point where you have to make those decisions, that means that you're doing effective sets, right? So whether or not you should move one rep in one direction or the other, I mean, that's probably something that, a couple sessions and you'll kind of have that dialed in on where you need to be, right? If you're just conscious for your fatigue and your performance.
I love that. Yeah, cool.
All right, probably got time for one more. Dave's got to be gone at 4:30.
I was just going to say, mine's like a quick thing, Abel, but then you can go ahead. Just more of like a summary. Because I agree with what you said, with the example of the genetic freak, 70 pounds of muscle potential. Something I've said for a while that I hadn't seen too many other people say, but I said, I think there's so many ways to get to this end result. And I don't love when somebody says like, this plan is going to, push you past your potential or something like that. I think obviously there are better and worse routines, but I think as long as it's a sound routine, it will often get you there. But your argument, I think, would be that you are going to get somebody there, as you mentioned, like faster and in a less injurious way. Would you say that's like a general summary for N1 is like, okay, we want to get there as efficiently as possible. But you're not saying like, hey, like, what the people did in the 90s and early 2000s, like that's not going to get you there. It's just you found a more efficient way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's more efficient. It's definitely healthier, but the big thing is I mean, a lot of people like they think like, oh, you come up with these exercises and then that therefore means people have to do it. And really what we're just trying to do is give people the tools so that when somebody does like have that area that does need that specific attention, that now you have a tool for that job, right? Versus just saying, well, I'm just going to throw more volume at it, or try and do intensity techniques or whatever. It can be like, oh, hey, I've been training whatever, for how many years or whatever, and this is the physique I've developed, but there's a few parts that haven't been coming along. Now all of a sudden, like here's some things that might be solutions for doing that don't just require you to just grind and grind and grind forever, or just have to wait, longer and longer for those things to come up. So I would say probably the biggest thing, because I mean, you could argue that like, if you take like if you take like a Mike Israel version of like an exercise where it's like, what is that? It's a total back exercise, like neck to ass crack, all in one exercise. It's called the neck exercise, right? There's like, that's a lot of stimulus in one single motion, right? And so you could argue that like that actually might be the most efficient approach at a certain point in time for somebody, versus doing a bunch of like biased exercises, because they're going to have to do more exercises and time and whatever. So maybe like, hey, they can get more bang for their buck out of these certain movements, but that won't always be the case. Eventually, what's likely going to happen is some things are going to grow better than others, and there will be discrepancy, and then there will be discrepancies in strength, and there will be joint things and things to work around and whatnot. And so by having the ability to say, hey, all right, I've been doing this, but it's not for me, it's not working the lower portion of my lat as well. Now I know what I can do to my training to get more of that in, either by adjusting the omni exercise that I'm doing that kind of works everything to be a little bit closer to that, or to be like, what exercises would I add to that or prioritize that would now do that? So really it's about just being more efficient, but also just being able to be a problem solver on your physique journey, right? Because everybody's going to have something that they're either going to want to prioritize, or they're going to have something that they need to work around at some point, right?
Yeah.
David,
I think no, I'll leave that, because I think that was a good closing. So I'm just gonna close it even more with this comment. So I think at the end of the day, it's really hard to prove whether it's this or that way, and I think it's completely reasonable to have at least have the stance that okay, if someone has good genetics, for them it might actually not matter if they're doing like pull arounds and iliac chest supported pull downs, or just rows and wide grip pull downs. But for someone who has crappy genetics for lat development, for them actually that might make a tangible benefit. And of course they will never get to the level of those, but for me, for example, like if there was some bicep exercise which would get my arms to just 16 inches, that would be kind of a big deal for me. But I would still not have the arms of like a 17-inch guy.
That's kind of what Aaron and I said on our podcast too, is like, for me, like it does matter at this point, like where I am in my journey, like it helps with staying interested. I like the cerebral side that it brings to training. And as I've said many times, like I'm 39 years old and I have no aches and pains or things bothering me. And I couldn't say the same 5 years ago or 6 years ago when I was doing CrossFit. And even before that,
34 years old.
I was 34 years old, right? And I couldn't say it at 24 when I was doing max OT either. So at 39, training with slightly more focus on these things have at least allowed me to continue training and feel good doing so.
Yeah, it is very interesting to be lifting more pain-free now than in my 20s. Like,
yeah.
So yeah. All right.
Best.
We'll wrap it up here, guys. But honestly, you guys kind of sucked. You were way too easy on me, I think. Like
I had a few more.
We might have to do this again. Like
we're all
I'm
podcast
about
hosts, and we've learned to not be jerks to guests.
All right. So I'll talk some shit about you guys on Instagram to get you riled up for the next one or something, right?
I have a couple more, so we'll save them for next time.
Yeah. Awesome, guys. Thank you very much.
Yep.
And I'll send this recording out
Thank
later
you.
to all of you guys.
Thanks, dude.
Okay.
See you guys.
Awesome.